Across the Gulf by Henry S. Whitehead. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Ben Tucker. Across the Gulf by Henry S. Whitehead. For the first year or thereabouts after his Scotch mother's death, the successful lawyer Alan Carrington was conscious, among his other feelings, of a kind of vague dread that she might appear as a character in one of his dreams, as she had often assured him her mother had come to her. Being the man he was, he resented this feeling as an incongruity. Yet there was a certain background for the feeling of dread. It had been one of his practical mother's convictions that such an appearance of her long-dead mother always preceded a disaster in the family. Such aversions as he might possess against the maternal side of his ancestry were all included in his dislike for belief in this kind of thing. When he agreed that the Scotch are a dour race, he always had reference, at least mentally, to this superstitious strain associated with that race from time immemorial, concrete to his experience because of this belief of his mother's, against which he had always fought. He carried out dutifully, and with a high degree of professional skill, all her various expressed desires, and continued after her death to live in their large, comfortable house. Perhaps because his mother never did appear in such dreams as he happened to remember, his dread became less and less poignant. At the end of 2 years or so, occupied with the thronging interests of a public man in the full power of his early maturity, it had almost ceased to be so much as a memory. In the spring of his 44th year, Carrington, who had long worked at high pressure and virtually without vacations, was apprised by certain mental and physical indications which his physician interpreted vigorously, that he must take at least the whole summer off and devote himself to recuperation. Rest, said the doctor, for his overworked mind and under-exercised body, was imperatively indicated. Carrington was able to set his nearly innumerable interests and affairs in order in something like 3 weeks, by means of highly concentrated efforts to that end. Then debilitated physically from this extra strain upon his depleted resources, he had to meet the problem of where he was to go and what he was to do. He was, of course, too deeply set in the rut of his routines to find such a decision easy. Fortunately, this problem was solved for him by a letter, which he received unexpectedly from one of his cousins on his mother's side, the Reverend Fergus MacDonald, a gentleman with whom he had had slight contacts. Dr. MacDonald had retained a developed pastoral instinct which he could no longer satisfy in the management of a parish. He was besides too little robust to risk assuming, at least for some time to come, the wearing burden of teaching. He compromised the matter by establishing a summer camp for boys in his still desirable Adirondacks. Being devoid of experience in business matters, he associated with himself a certain Thomas Starkey, a young man whom the ravages of the White Plague had snatched away from a sales managership and driven into the quasi-exile of Sarenay, where Dr. MacDonald had met him. This association proved highly successful for the half-dozen years that it had lasted. Then Starkey, after a brave battle for his health, had succumbed just at a period when his trained business intelligence would have been most helpful to the affairs of the camp. Dazed at this blow, Dr. MacDonald had desisted from his labors after literary distinction long enough to write to his cousin Carrington, beseeching his legal and financial counsel. When Carrington had read the last of his cousin's finished periods, he decided at once, and dispatched a telegram announcing his immediate setting out for the camp, his intention to remain through the summer, and the promise to assume full charge of the business management. He started for the Adirondacks the next afternoon. His presence brought immediate order out of confusion. Dr. MacDonald, on the evening of the second day of his cousin's administration of affairs, got down on his knees and returned thanks to his Maker for the undeserved beneficence which had sent this financial angel of light into the midst of his affairs in this his hour of dire need. Thereafter, the Reverend Doctor immersed himself more and more deeply in his wonted task of producing the solid literature dear to the hearts of his editors. But if Carrington's coming had improved matters at the camp, the balance of indebtedness was far from being one-sided. For the first week or so, the reaction from his accustomed way of life had caused him to feel, if anything, even staler and more nerve-racked than before. But that first unpleasantness past, the invigorating air of the balsam-laden pine woods began to show its restorative effects rapidly. He found that he was sleeping like the dead. He could not get enough sleep, it appeared. His appetite increased, and he found that he was putting on needed weight. The business management of a boys' camp, absurdly simple after the complex matters of big business with which he had long been occupied, was only a spice to this new existence among the deep shadows and sunny spaces of the Adirondack country. At the end of a month of this, he confidently declared himself a new man. By the 1st of August, instead of the nervous wreck who had arrived sharply visaged and cadaverous 2 months before, Carrington presented the appearance of a robust, hard-muscled athlete of 30, 22 pounds heavier, and without a nerve in his body. On the evening of the 4th day of August, healthily weary after a long day's hike, Carrington retired soon after 9 o'clock and fell immediately into a deep and restful sleep. Toward morning, he dreamed of his mother for the first time since her death more than 6 years before. His dream took the form that he was lying there in his own bed, awake, a not altogether uncommon form of dream, and that he was very chilly in the region of the left shoulder. As is well known to those skilled in the scientific phenomena of the dream state, now a very prominent portion of the material used in psychological study, this kind of sensation in a dream virtually always is the result of an actual physical condition and is reproduced in the dream because of that actual background as a stimulus. Carrington's cold shoulder was toward the left hand, or outside of the bed, which stood against the wall of his large airy room. In his dream, he thought that he reached out his hand to replace the bedclothes, and as he did so, his hand was softly though firmly taken, and his mother's well-remembered voice said, "Lie still, laddie, I'll tuck you in." Then he thought his mother replaced the loosened covers and tucked them in about his shoulder with her competent touch. He wanted to thank her, and as he could not see her because of the position in which he was lying, he endeavored to open his eyes and turn over, being in that state commonly thought of as between sleep and waking. With some considerable effort, he succeeded in forcing open his reluctant eyes, but turning over was a much more difficult matter, it appeared. He had to fight against an overpowering inclination to sink back comfortably into the deep sleep, from which in his dream he had awakened to find his shoulder disagreeably uncomfortable. The warmth of the replaced covers was an additional inducement to sleep. At last, with a determined wrench, he overcame his desire to go to sleep again, and rolled over to his left side by dint of a strong effort of his will, smiling gratefully and about to express his thanks. But at the instant of accomplishing this victory of the will, he actually awakened in precisely the position recorded in his mind in the dream state. Where he had expected to meet his mother's eyes, he saw nothing, but there remained with him a persistent impression that he had felt the withdrawal of her hand from where, on his shoulder, it had rested caressingly. The grateful warmth of the bedclothes in that cool morning remained, however, and he observed that they were well tucked in about that shoulder. His dream had clearly been of the type which George Maurauder speaks of in Peter Ibbotson. He had dreamed true, and it required several minutes before he could rid himself of the impression that his mother, moved by some strange whimsicality, had stepped out of his sight, perhaps hidden herself behind the bed. He was actually about to look back at the bed before the utter absurdity of the idea became fully apparent to him. The back of the bed stood close against the wall of the room. His mother had been dead more than 6 years. He jumped out of bed at the sound of reveille, blown by the camp bugler, and this abrupt action dissipated his impressions. Their memory remained, however, very clear-cut in his mind for the next 2 days. The impression of his mother's nearness in the course of that vivid dream had recalled her to his mind with the greatest clarity. With this revived impression of her, too, there marched almost of necessity, he supposed, in his mind the old idea which he had dreaded. The idea that she would come to him to warn him of some impending danger. Curiously enough, as he analyzed his sensations, he found that there remained none of the old resentment connected with this speculation, such as had characterized it during the period immediately after his mother's death. His maturity, the preoccupations of an exceptionally full and active life, and the tenderness which marked all his memories of his mother, had served to remove from his mind all traces of that idea. The possibility of a warning in his dream of his dear mother only caused him to smile during those days after the dream, during which the revived impression of his mother slowly faded thin. But it was the indulgent, slightly melancholy smile of revived nostalgia, a gentle, faint sense of homesickness, such as might have affect any middle-aged man recently reminded of a beloved mother in some rather intense fashion. On the evening of the second day after his dream, he was walking toward the camp garage with some visitors, a man and woman, parents of one of the boys at the camp, intending to drive with them to the village to guide them in some minor purchases. Just beside the well-worn trail through the great pine trees halfway up the hill to the garage, the woman noticed a clump of large brownish mushrooms and inquired if they were an edible variety. Carrington picked one and examined it. To his limited knowledge, it seemed to have several of the marks of an edible mushroom. While they were standing beside the plain where the mushrooms grew, one of the was passed. Crocker! Called Mr. Carrington. Yes, Mr. Carrington, replied young Crocker, pausing. Crocker, your cabin is the one farthest south, isn't it? Yes, sir. Were you going there just now? Yes, Mr. Carrington. Can I do anything for you? Well, if it isn't too much trouble, you might take this mushroom over to Professor Benjamin's. You know where his camp is, just the other side of the wire fence beyond your cabin. And ask him to let us know whether or not this is an edible mushroom. I'm not quite sure myself. Certainly, replied the boy, pleased to be allowed out of bounds, even to the extent of the few rods separating the camp property from that of the gentleman named by Carrington, a university teacher regarded locally as a great expert on mushrooms, fungi, and such like things. Carrington called out after the disappearing boy. Oh, Crocker! Yes, Mr. Carrington. Throw it away if Dr. Benjamin says it's no good. But if he says it's all right, bring it back, please, and leave it on the mantel shelf in the big living room. Do you mind? All right, sir, shouted Crocker over his shoulder and trotted on. Returning from the village an hour later, Carrington found the mushroom on the mantel shelf in the living room. He placed it in a large paper bag, left it in the kitchen in a safe place, and the next morning before breakfast walked up the trail toward the garage and filled his paper bag with mushrooms. He liked mushrooms, and so doubtless did the people who had noticed these. He decided he would prepare the mushrooms himself. There would be just about enough for 3 generous portions. Mushrooms were not commonly eaten as a breakfast dish, but this was camp. Exchanging a pleasant good morning with the young colored man who served as assistant cook and who was engaged in getting breakfast ready, and smilingly declining his offer to prepare the mushrooms, he peeled them, warmed a generous lump of fresh country butter in a large frying pan, and began cooking them. A delightfully appetizing odor arising from the pan provoked respectful banter from the young cook, amused at the camp director's efforts along the lines of his own profession. And the two chatted while Carrington turned his mushrooms over and over in the butter with a long fork. When they were done exactly to a turn, and duly peppered and salted, Carrington left them in the pan, which he took off the stove and set about the preparation of the 3 canapes of fried toast. He was going to serve his mushrooms in style, as the grinning young cook slyly remarked. He grinned back and divided the mushrooms into 3 equal portions, each on its canape, which he asked the undercook to keep hot in the oven during the brief interval until a mess call should bring everybody at camp in to breakfast. Then with his long fork, he speared several small pieces of mushroom which had got broken in the pan. After blowing these cool on the fork, Carrington, grinning like a boy, put them in his mouth and began to eat them. Good, sir? Inquired the assistant cook. Delicious, mumbled Carrington enthusiastically, his mouth full of the succulent bits. After he had swallowed his mouthful, he remarked, But I must have left a bit of the hide on one of them. There's a little trace of bitter. Look out for 'em, sir, enjoined the undercook, suddenly grave. They're plumb wicked when they ain't just right, sir. These are all right, returned Carrington reassuringly. I had Professor Benjamin look them over. He sauntered out on the veranda, waiting for the bugle call. From many directions, the boys and a few visitors were struggling in toward the mess hall, after a morning dip in the lake and cabin inspection. From their room in the guest house, the people with whom he had been the evening before came across the broad veranda toward him. He was just turning toward them with a smile of pleasant greeting when the very hand of death fell on him. Without warning, a sudden terrible griping accompanied by a deathly coldness, and this immediately followed by a pungent, burning heat, ran through his body. Great beads of sweat sprang out on his forehead. His knees began to give under him. Everything, all this pleasant world about him of brilliant morning sunshine and deep, sharply defined shadow turned greenish and dim. His senses started to slip away from him in the numbness which closed down like a relentless hand, crushing out his consciousness. With an effort which seemed to wrench his soul and tear him with unimagined pain, he gathered all his waning forces, and sustained only by a mighty effort of his powerful will, he staggered through the open doorway of the mess hall into the kitchen. He nearly collapsed as he leaned against the nearest table, articulating between fast paralyzing lips. "Water and mustard! Quick, the mushrooms!" The head cook, that moment arrived in the kitchen, happened to be quick-minded. The undercook, too, had, of course, some preparation for this possibility. One of the men seized a bowl just used for beating eggs, and with shaking hands poured it half full of warm water from a heating kettle on the stove. Into this the other emptied nearly half a tin of dry mustard, which he stirred about frantically with his floury hand. This, his eyes rolling with terror, he held to Carrington's lips, and Carrington, concentrating afresh all his remaining faculties, forced the nauseous fluid through his blue lips, and swallowed painfully great saving gulps of the powerful emetic. Again and yet again the two Negroes renewed the dose. One of the counselors, on dining room duty, coming into the kitchen, sensed something terribly amiss, and ran to support Carrington. 10 minutes later, vastly nauseated, trembling with weakness, but safe, Carrington, leaning heavily on the young counselor, walked up and down behind the mess hall. His first words, after he could speak coherently, were to order the assistant cook to burn the contents of the 3 hot plates in the oven. He had eaten a large mouthful of one of the most deadly varieties of poisonous mushroom, one containing the swiftly acting vegetable alkaloids which spell certain death. His few moments' respite, as he reasoned the matter out afterward, had been undoubtedly due to his having cooked the mushrooms in butter, of which he had been lavish. This, thoroughly soaked up by the mushrooms, had for a brief period resisted digestion. Very gradually, as he walked up and down, taking in deep breaths of the sweet pine-scented air, his strength returned to him. After he had thoroughly walked off the faintness which had followed the violent treatment to which he had subjected himself, he went up to his room, and still terribly shaken by his experience and narrow escape from death, went to bed to rest. Crocker, it appeared, had duly carried out his instructions. Dr. Benjamin had looked at the specimen, and told the boy that there were several varieties of this mushroom, not easily to be distinguished from one another, of which some were wholesome, and one contained a deadly alkaloid. Being otherwise occupied at the time, he would have to defer his opinion until he had had an opportunity for a more thorough examination. He had handed back the mushroom submitted to him, and the lad had given it to a counselor, who had put it on the mantel-shelf, intending to report to Mr. Carrington the following morning. Weak still, and very drowsy, Carrington lay on his bed, and silently thanked the powers above for having preserved his life. Abruptly he thought of his mother. The warning! At once it was as though she stood in the room beside his bed, as though their long, close companionship had not been interrupted by death. A wave of affectionate gratitude suffused him. Under its influence he rose warily, and sank to his knees beside the bed, his head on his arms, in the very spot where his mother had seemed to stand in his dream. Tears welled into his eyes and fell unnoticed as he communed silently with her who had brought him into the world, whose watchful love and care not even death could interrupt or vitiate. Silently, fervently, he spoke across the gulf to his mother. He choked with silent sobs as understanding of her invincible love came to him and overwhelmed him. Then, to the accompaniment of a tremulous calmness which seemed to fall upon him abruptly, he had the sense of her, standing close beside him as she stood in his dream. He dared not raise his eyes, because now he knew that he was awake. It seemed to him as though she spoke, though there came to him no sensation of anything that could be compared to sound. "You must be getting back into your bed, laddie." And keeping his eyes tightly shut, lest he disturb this visitation, he awkwardly fumbled his way back into bed. He settled himself on his back in an overpowering drowsiness, perhaps begotten of his recent shock, and its attendant bodily weakness ran through him like a benediction and a refreshing wind. As he drifted down over the threshold of consciousness, into the deep and prolonged sleep of physical exhaustion, which completely restored him, His last remembrance was of the lingering caress of his mother's firm hand resting on his shoulder. End of Across the Gulf by Henry S. Whitehead.
The Beautiful Suit by H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Louise J. Bell. The Beautiful Suit by H.G. Wells. There was once a little man whose mother made him a beautiful suit of clothes. It was green and gold, and woven so that I cannot describe how delicate and fine it was. And there was a tie of orange fluffiness that tied up under his chin. And the buttons, in their newness, shone like stars. He was proud and pleased by his suit beyond measure, and stood before the long looking-glass when first he put it on, so astonished and delighted with it that he could hardly turn himself away. He wanted to wear it everywhere and show it to all sorts of people. He thought over all the places he had ever visited and all the scenes he had ever heard described, and tried to imagine what the feel of it would be if he were to go now to those scenes and places wearing his shining suit. And he wanted to go out forthwith into the long grass and the hot sunshine of the meadow wearing it, just to wear it. But his mother told him no. She told him he must take great care of his suit, for never would he have another nearly so fine. He must save it, and only wear it on rare and great occasions. It was his wedding suit, she said. And she took the buttons and twisted them up with tissue paper for fear their bright newness should be tarnished. And she tacked little guards over the cuffs and elbows and wherever the suit was most likely to come to harm. He hated and resisted these things, but what could he do? And at last, her warnings and persuasions had effect, and he consented to take off his beautiful suit and fold it into its proper creases and put it away. It was almost as though he gave it up again, but he was always thinking of wearing it, and of the supreme occasions when someday it might be worn without the guards, without the tissue paper on the buttons, utterly and delightfully, never caring, beautiful beyond measure. One night, when he was dreaming of it after his habit, he dreamt he took the tissue paper from one of the buttons and found its brightness a little faded, and that distressed him mightily in his dream. He polished the poor faded button and polished it, and, if anything, it grew duller. He woke up and lay awake, thinking of the brightness a little dulled, and wondering how he would feel if, perhaps, when the great occasion, whatever it might be, should arrive, one button should chance to be ever so little short of its first glittering freshness. And for days and days that thought remained with him, distressingly. And when next his mother let him wear his suit, he was tempted, and nearly gave way to the temptation, just to fumble off one little bit of tissue paper and see if, indeed, the buttons were keeping as bright as ever. He went trimly along on his way to church, full of this wild desire. For you must know his mother did, with repeated and careful warnings, let him wear his suit at times. On Sundays, for example, to and fro from church, when there was no threatening of rain, no dust blowing, nor anything to injure it, with its buttons covered and its protections tacked upon it, and a sunshade in his hand to shadow it if there seemed too strong a sunlight for its colors. And always, after such occasions, he brushed it over and folded it exquisitely, as she had taught him, and put it away again. Now, all these restrictions his mother set to the wearing of his suit, he obeyed. Always he obeyed them. Until, one strange night, he woke up and saw the moonlight shining outside his window. It seemed to him the moonlight was not common moonlight, nor the night a common night. And for a while he lay quite drowsily, with this odd persuasion in his mind. Thought joined on to thought, like things that whisper warmly in the shadows. Then he sat up in his little bed, suddenly very alert, with his heart beating very fast, and a quiver in his body from top to toe. He had made up his mind. He knew that now he was going to wear his suit as it should be worn. He had no doubt in the matter. He was afraid, terribly afraid, but glad, glad. He got out of his bed and stood for a moment by the window, looking at the moonshine-flooded garden and trembling at the thing he meant to do. The air was full of a minute clamor of crickets and murmurings, of the infinitesimal shoutings of little living things. He went very gently across the creaking boards, for fear that he might wake the sleeping house, to the big, dark clothes press, wherein his beautiful suit lay folded, and he took it out, garment by garment, and softly and very eagerly tore off its tissue paper covering and its tacked protections, until there it was, perfect and delightful, as he had seen it when first his mother had given it to him, a long time, it seemed, ago. Not a button had tarnished, not a thread had faded on this dear suit of his. He was glad enough for weeping, as in a noiseless hurry he put it on. And then back he went, soft and quick, to the window that looked out upon the garden, and stood there for a minute, shining in the moonlight, with his buttons twinkling like stars, before he got out on the sill and, making as little of a rustling as he could, clambered down to the garden path below. He stood before his mother's house, and it was white and nearly as plain as by day, with every window blind but his own shut like an eye that sleeps. The trees cast still shadows, like intricate black lace, upon the wall. The garden in the moonlight was very different from the garden by day. Moonshine was tangled in the hedges and stretched in phantom cobwebs from spray to spray. Every flower was gleaming white or crimson black, and the air was aquiver with the thridding of small crickets and nightingales singing unseen in the depths of the trees. There was no darkness in the world, but only warm, mysterious shadows. And all the leaves and spikes were edged and lined with iridescent jewels of dew. The night was warmer than any night had ever been. The heavens, by some miracle, at once vaster and nearer. And, spite of the great ivory-tinted moon that ruled the world, the sky was full of stars. The little man did not shout nor sing for all his infinite gladness. He stood for a time like one awe-stricken, and then, with a queer, small cry, and holding out his arms, he ran out, as if he would embrace at once the whole round immensity of the world. He did not follow the neat set paths that cut the garden squarely, but thrust across the beds and through the wet, tall, scented herbs, through the nightstock and the nicotine and the clusters of phantom white mallow flowers, and through the thickets of southernwood and lavender, and knee-deep across a wide space of mignonette. He came to the great hedge, and he thrust his way through it. And, though the thorns of the brambles scored him deeply, and tore threads from his wonderful suit, and though burrs and goosegrass and havers caught and clung to him, he did not care. He did not care, for he knew it was all part of the wearing for which he had longed. "I am glad I put on my suit," he said. "I am glad I wore my suit." Beyond the hedge, he came to the duck pond, or at least to what was the duck pond by day. But by night, it was a great bowl of silver moonshine, all noisy with singing frogs, of wonderful silver moonshine, twisted and clotted with strange patternings. And the little man ran down into its waters, between the thin black rushes, knee-deep and waist-deep, and to his shoulders, smiting the water to black and shining wavelets with either hand, swaying and shivering wavelets, amidst which the stars were netted in the tangled reflections of the brooding trees upon the bank. He waded until he swam, and so he crossed the pond and came out upon the other side, trailing, as it seemed to him, not duckweed, but very silver in long, clinging, dripping masses. And up he went, through the transfigured tangles of the willow herb, and the uncut seeding grasses of the farther bank. He came, glad and breathless, into the high road. "I am glad," he said, beyond measure that I had clothes that fitted this occasion. The high road ran straight as an arrow flies, straight into the deep blue pit of sky beneath the moon, a white and shining road between the singing nightingales, and along it he went, running now and leaping, and now walking and rejoicing, in the clothes his mother had made for him with tireless, loving hands. The road was deep in dust, but that, for him, was only soft whiteness. And as he went, a great, dim moth came fluttering round his wet and shimmering and hastening figure. At first he did not heed the moth, and then he waved his hands at it and made a sort of dance with it as it circled round his head. "Soft moth," he cried, "dear moth, and wonderful night of the world. Do you think my clothes are beautiful, dear moth? As beautiful as your scales, and all this silver vesture of the earth and sky?" And the moth circled closer and closer, until at last its velvet wings just brushed his lips. And next morning they found him dead, with his neck broken, in the bottom of the stone pit, with his beautiful clothes a little bloody and foul and stained with the duckweed from the pond. But his face was a face of such happiness that, had you seen it, you would have understood, indeed, how that he had died happy, never knowing that cool and streaming silver for the duckweed in the pond. End of The Beautiful Suit by H.G. Wells. Recording by Louise J. Bell. Sebastopol, California.
The Boy Possessed by S. Mukherjee. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. I am Sandhya Veduri from Sydney location, reading the story on 3rd March 2022. The Boy Possessed by S. Mukherjee. I think it was in 1906 that in one of the principal cities in India, the son of a rich man became ill. He had high fever and delirium, and in his insensible state, he was constantly talking in a language which was some kind of English, but which the relatives could not understand. This boy was reading in one of the lower classes of a school and hardly knew the English language. When the fever would not abate for 24 hours, a doctor was sent for. The doctor arrived and went in to see the patient in the sick room. The boy was lying on the bed with his eyes closed. It was nearly evening. As soon as the doctor entered the sick room, the boy shouted, "Doctor, I am very hungry. Order some food for me." Of course, the doctor thought that the boy was in his senses. He did not know that the boy had not sufficient knowledge of the English language to express his ideas in that tongue. So the doctor asked his relations when he had taken food last. He was informed that the patient had had nothing to eat for the last 8 or 10 hours. "What will you have?" asked the doctor. "Roast mutton and plenty of vegetables," said the boy. By this time, the doctor had approached the bedside, but it was too dark to see whether the eyes of the patient were open or not. But you are ill. Roast mutton will do you harm, said the doctor. No, it won't. I know what is good for me, said the patient. At this stage, the doctor was informed that the patient did not really know much English and that he was probably in delirium. A suggestion was also made that probably he was possessed by a ghost. The doctor, who had been educated at the Calcutta Medical College, did not quite believe the ghost theory. He, however, asked the patient who he was. In India, I do not know whether this is so in European countries too. Lots of people were possessed by ghosts, and the ghost speaks through this victim. So, generally, a question like this is asked by the exorcist. Who are you and why are you troubling the poor patient? The answer, I am told, is at once given, and the ghost says what he wants. Of course, I personally have never heard a ghost talk. I know a case in which a report was made to me that the wife of a groom of mine had been possessed by a ghost. On being asked what ghost it was the woman was reported to have said, the big ghost of the house across the drain. I ran to the outhouses to find out how much was true, but when I reached the stables, the woman, I was told, was not talking. I found her in convulsions. To return to our story, the doctor asked the patient who he was. I am General dash dash dash, said the boy. Why are you here? Asked the doctor. I shall tell you that after I have had my roast mutton and the vegetables, said the boy, or rather the ghost. But how can we be convinced that you are General dash dash? Asked the doctor. Call Captain X of the 11 Brahmas and you will know, said the ghost. In the meantime, get me the food or I shall kill the patient. The father of the patient at once began to shout that he would get the mutton and the vegetables. The doctor in the meantime rushed out to procure some more medical assistance as well to fetch Captain X of the 11 Brahmas. The few big European officers of the station were also informed, and within a couple of hours, the sick room was full of sensible, educated gentlemen. The mutton was in the meantime ready. The mutton is ready, said the doctor. Lower it into the well in the compound, said the ghost. A basket was procured, and the mutton and the vegetables were lowered into the well. But scarcely had the basket has gone down 5 yards, the well was 40 feet deep, when somebody from inside the well shouted, take it away, there is no salt in it. Those that were responsible for the preparation had to admit their mistake. The basket was pulled out and some salt was put in and the basket was lowered down again. But as the basket went in about 5 or 6 yards, somebody from inside the well pulled it down with such force that the man who was lowering it narrowly escaped being dragged in. Fortunately, he let the rope slip through his hands, with the result that though he did not fall into the well, his hands were bleeding profusely. Nothing happened after that, and everybody returned to the patient. After a few minutes' silence, the patient said, take away the rope and the basket. Why did you not tie the end of the rope to the post? Why did you pull it so hard? Said one of the persons present. I was hungry and in a hurry, said the ghost. They asked several persons to go down into the well, but nobody would. At last, a fishing hook was lowered down. The basket, which had at first completely disappeared, was now floating on the surface of the water. It was brought up quite empty. Captain X, in the meantime, has arrived and was taken to the patient. 2 high officials of the government, both Europeans, had also arrived. As soon as the captain stepped into the sick room of the patient, we shall now call him Ghost, said, Good evening, Captain X. These people will not believe that I am General dash dash and I want to convince them. The captain was as surprised as the others had been before. You may ask me anything you like, Captain X, and I shall try to convince you, said the ghost. The captain stood staring. Speak, Captain X, are you dumb? Said the ghost. I don't understand anything, stammered the captain. He was told everything by those present. After hearing it, the captain formulated a question from one of the military books. A correct reply was immediately given. Then followed a number of questions by the captain, the replies to all which were promptly given by the ghost. After this, the ghost said, "If you are all convinced, you may go now and see me again tomorrow morning." Everybody quietly withdrew. The next morning, there was a large gathering in the sick room. A number of European officers who had heard the story at the club on the previous evening dropped in. "Introduce each of these newcomers to me," said the ghost. Kept next introduced each person in solemn form. "If anybody is curious to know anything, I shall tell him," said the ghost. A few questions about England, position of buildings, shops, streets in London were asked and correctly answered. After all the questions, the Indian doctor who had been in attendance asked, "Now, General, that we are convinced you are so and so, why are you troubling this poor boy?" "His father is rich," said the ghost. "Not very," said the doctor. "But what do you want from him to do?" "My tomb at Dashpur has been destroyed by a branch of a tree falling upon it. I want that to be properly repaired," said the ghost. "I shall get that done immediately," said the father of the patient. "If you do that within a week, I shall trouble your boy no longer," said the ghost. The monument was repaired, and the boy has been never ill since. This is the whole story. A portion of it appeared in the papers, and there were several respectable witnesses, though the whole story is too wonderful. Inexplicable as it is, it appears that dead persons are a bit jealous of the sanctity